are we talking about today?
We are talking about, it's actually apropos that you slammed your fist on the table, because we are talking about totalitarianism and the two world wars. So this is 7.2 in your textbook. So
Follow along.
Okay, so the first concept that we need to talk about is supranationalism. Do you know what supranationalism is?
Well, super means a lot, or really big, or great. And nationalism means the self-identification with a nation state as opposed to like necessarily a particular culture. And so, you know, the rise of the nation state is this modern thing that we don't think about.
Right. So basically what it means is you are so gung-ho about your country, like your national identity is like the most important thing for you. So more important than your faith, more important than any other thing like a culture or a language or anything that you could particularly identify with. It's your nation that you're all about. So it's like a super patriotism. But the problem with supranationalism is that it is an overemphasis on your particular nation at the expense of all the rest. So it's basically like my nation, right or wrong. So like it doesn't matter if what we're doing is technically ethical or unethical, or maybe we're not really the best at certain things, but we just pretend like we're the best no matter what, and we're just going to go with our nation because it's our nation. So that's supranationalism. So this is something that's causing a lot of problems in the mid-20th century. And today, yeah, can definitely be. We could talk about that. Today, people kind of feel this way, but in a particular way, it was really coming on the scene in the early 1900s to mid 1900s. And so it was really one of the causes of World War I. So there's certain nations that are sort of so self-interested that it's causing conflict with other nations in the world. Okay, so I want to talk about World War I for a minute, because World War I don't think we quite realize how just like completely devastating this war was for the world, for society.
Well, the war started and there were still cavalry on horseback. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about that. They were still fighting with soldiers on horseback,
like hand to hand kind
and by the
like
end
fighting.
of it there was like nerve gas and chemical warfare and planes dropping bombs. So it was this war that took us from a more ancient style or an older type of war into modern warfare with massive groups of people, massive amounts of people, and that was made possible by the Industrial Revolution.
Right. So last section we were talking about the various factories and the ability now for us to have assembly lines and to create products quicker. And so various nations in Europe are making use of this in order to now produce munitions, right? So like all sorts of things that we can use to kill a lot of people. Machine
guns, bombs, chemical warfare, tear gas, things like that. Mm-hmm. That's a World War I thing. And also, just as of right now, or because of right now, it's important to think the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 happens right in the middle of World War I, and there's a lot of deaths on the battlefield because of that.
So the Pope during World War I was Pope Benedict XV. Now, he was a person who was more of a quiet person. He was kind of sickly, but he had been a diplomat for a long time. So he was a person who was used to sort of political intricacies, working things out between two parties that were sort of against each other, stuff like that. So he really hated the war. He hated World War I because of the conflict that it was causing between nations. He thought that it was unjust. He thought that he shouldn't take sides. He really saw himself as the spiritual father of Catholics around the world and really the whole world in general. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't like the war. And so he spoke out against it a lot. However, even as he was speaking out against the war, he took every measure necessary to provide for people who were suffering. So he did a lot of humanitarian work during and after the war to provide for people who were affected by the war. He was constantly offering himself to mediate discussions between warring nations. He wanted to bring about peace as swiftly as possible and in a way that was lasting. And so he offered peace proposals and peace plans. As a diplomat, he had experience with these things, and he was trying to get the various nations in the war to be able to come to this agreement or this compromise such that people would not be affected adversely in the future. He was largely ignored. Most people did not pay attention to these peace plans that he was offering. They did not allow him to even come to the meetings that these leaders of nations were having, again, about peace, like trying to come to a conclusion. And so what ended up happening was the Treaty of Versailles, which, as many of you probably know, required the unconditional surrender of Germany in the war. And do you know what that ended up causing?
Hitler.
Basically Hitler. So lots of economic problems in Germany.
Basically the economic and societal backdrop for Nazism to be able to take control in Germany. You've heard the history before, right? All of the sanctions, all the money they owed, basically kicking their butt so hard that they were such poverty that Hitler was like, you want to beat poverty? And they're like, no. And he's like, follow my crazy boo-hiney.
So basically Hitler takes advantage of the situation. Germany is economically just wrecked because of the Treaty of Versailles and because of the war in general. And so he's like, hey, I'm going to be your savior. I'm going to be the one that's going to get you out of this poverty, that's going to get us out of this debt, that's going to make us the greatest nation in the history of the world, on the face of the planet, right? It's near the end of the war and into like after the war, and there are more casualties of Spanish flu than there were actually of the war, and there were a lot of the war. So it's crazy. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on that basically decimates Europe. So we're talking economically, politically, just like psychologically. I mean, people dealing with trench warfare, right? So they're digging a trench, they're throwing tear gas, they're throwing bombs, they're throwing grenades, they're throwing all sorts of things at each other. And it's
no one's really gaining ground.
Right. And it's just, it feels like this stalemate where people are just dying and dying and dying and suffering and basically experiencing torturous conditions, and that's going to take a toll on people psychologically. And so these people who have been just totally shaken by their experiences in World War I are then coming back to what? And a lot of times people didn't really see that there was any sort of real resolution to World War I in a way that they felt like they really accomplish something by fighting the war. And so that caused a lot of people to start questioning government, questioning their faith, questioning the world in general, their whole lives, and just kind of like a lot of people were falling apart. And so that causes a spiritual crisis where people are starting to doubt their own faith. And they're starting to try to find solace or some sort of sense of purpose, or they're trying to numb the pain that they're experiencing by entering into certain behaviors that became popular during what we call the Roaring 20s, right?
Flappers.
So like
Great Gatsby.
Yeah, Great Gatsby. If y'all have read Great Gatsby in your English class, a lot of the
loose-fitting suits.
The parties, right? The drinking, the kind of just getting totally blackout drunk, like just all these different things that are becoming popular, just seeing how extravagant you could possibly be with the way that you're conducting your lifestyle. And a lot of this is very directly related to the disillusionment that people are feeling after World War I. So you start having psychologists like Sigmund Freud came on the scene during that time, who was a sort of an atheistic philosopher or a psychologist that was trying to, I guess in his own way, deal with these issues and try to figure out where these things are coming from, but also causing a lot of people even more psychological issues based on what he was teaching. So you want anything to say about that?
No, I mean, I think it's war and epidemic and hardship basically is the problem of evil. And so I think what people were responding to was a real visceral experience of evil. Maybe in other time periods they might have just experienced it on a family level or a city level or a town or in their relationships. But this was closely encountering the fallenness of the human person, and you had a choice in how you responded. A lot of people responded in diving into the abyss that is an atheistic worldview.
Right. Okay, so also during this time, between the wars, you have the rise of two different totalitarian types of government. And so one of them we've already mentioned, which is communism. So in 1917, you have the Russian Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, and the USSR is created, so the Soviet Union. And so you have...
During World War I?
Yeah.
Goodness gracious.
So this is happening all at the same time. So 1917 is a really pivotal year, actually, because you have World War I going on. You have the Russian Revolution in Russia. You have the Mexican Communist Revolution, which is also taking place. And so into that chaos, we also have what Catholic thing? Do you know?
1917. Oh, Fatima.
Fatima, right. So Fatima, Portugal, Mary appears to three little shepherd children, and she starts basically
We needed us some
us,
Mary.
We did. And she started telling us, like, hey, you guys better start praying the rosary for Russia and for all of the craziness that is going on in this world, right?
What
so that was
prayer
part
do
of
you
her...
pray often at school?
Do we pray?
Oh my Jesus,
Forgive us our sins,
save us from the fires of hell, lead all souls to heaven. Oh, I just said lead all souls to purgatory.
To purgatory. Why don't we just go to heaven? So lead all souls to heaven, especially those in most need of God's mercy. And guess who is in need of God's mercy? The entire world right now, because there's a lot of things going on. So that's the Fatima prayer. Mary taught that prayer to the shepherd children to add to their recitation of the rosary, which is why we say it.
And then in 1918, you know what else happened? The Black Sox scandal. Shoeless Joe Jackson and all the other White Sox threw the World Series and cheated, and that's why they're stuck in the cornfield and Field of Dreams. They can't go to baseball heaven.
Fun facts, all you baseball fans out there. Anyways, so in Russia, which is sort of the main hotbed of communism, you have Lenin and Stalin, who are the dictators of the USSR. And they were atheistic, they were totalitarian, which means that they had total control over what was going on in the country. It means that they used any means necessary to enact their policies. So that includes sending people to work camps, that includes executions, that includes arrests, that includes brutality, all sorts of things like that. And so there are millions of people that are killed at their hands in those areas. So that is a huge thing that's also contributing to the disillusionment that people are experiencing between the wars. Reacting in a certain sense against that, but also going off in the other direction in a bad way.
Once again, it's extremes. We never like the extremes.
Right. We have fascism. Okay, so fascism is a new form of totalitarianism, where basically you have these nations who have been economically decimated by World War I, and they're trying to rebuild their national identity. So again, the whole like super nationalism thing is going to be playing into this. And so they're trying to create the perfect state. So you can really think of Hitler whenever we're talking about this fascism. So he had his own particular brand of fascism, which was Nazism. So in Italy, you have Mussolini. In Germany, you have Hitler. In Spain, you have Franco. And all of them are trying to create various forms of a fascist state. So just kind of reclaiming their identity, trying to create this perfect society. And again, in order to do that, they use any means necessary. Propaganda, secret police, media control, right? So like you can only see what the state wants you to see, right? Arrests and executions of people who are going against whatever their plans are. And so this is what you start to see coming up into what causes eventually World War II. Okay.
And notice, with an atheistic worldview, right, ultimately what's called a nihilistic worldview, nihil meaning the German word for nothing. So if nothingness, if there's nothing behind the universe, then we're not held to a standard of morality. And so what is human dignity? What is the human person? Why does someone deserve respect and love and compassion? And why do they have a dignity that you can't offend? If there's a greater common good that we're trying to seek in these in communism, fascism, we're trying to seek it, then we'll do whatever we want. It doesn't matter who stands in the way, because ultimately the universe is meaningless. It's basically the philosophy of Billie Eilish.
Ooh, think about that one for a minute.
It's kind of scary.
It is kind of scary. All right, so a couple things that made me think of was one thing that I think it was Bishop Barron was talking about this. In the Mass, we sing the Gloria. And in that we say, glory to God in the highest and peace to people on earth. And one thing that he points out in discussing the Gloria is that when we don't have God in the highest place, we don't have peace on earth.
Oof.
When we put other things in the place of God, whether that's our national identity, whether that is our individualistic, like I just want what I want and everybody else can die in the gutter. We were talking about that
laissez-faire
before.
Capitalism.
Right, or social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, right? Like if I put anything else, including myself, in the place of God in my life, then there's necessarily going to be tension and like not peace between people, right? And so this solidarity, another principle of Catholic social teaching, starts to break apart, and then you get war, destruction, like all of these things that are causing problems that aren't really making people happy. So all of that kind of ties in together.
Yeah, and notice that atheism has brought more pain and more destruction and more violence in the 20th century and the 21st century as well than all of the so-called religious wars that maybe some of the communists and atheists would point to. Like, look at what religion does. It created violence and chaos in between people and wars. I think more people died. It did in some ways, but more people have died in the name of an atheistic worldview than a theistic one.
If you think about all of just like the sheer numbers of the people that die in the 20th century because of these systems, but also even just going back to like some of the things that were, or could be considered religious wars, like we talked about the 30 Years' War in the wake of the Reformations. Those were very much religious based, right? There's people fighting against each other, Protestants, Catholics, whoever else. And that's a problem. But like the whole point of this is that war, violence, all these things, it's not a result of religion. It's a result of sin. It's a result of our broken humanity because of the fall. If we put ourselves first, if we put our nation first, if we put all these other things that are not God first, it's necessarily going to cause friction. And so you see that even when people falsely fight in the name of religion, right? You see people making bad decisions that even go against their religion in order to fight with each other about that. And so it's a human problem. All right, the Pope between the wars was Pius XI. So Pius XI, he actually did something that was really helpful for the church. And we'll get to this, but it was helpful for the Jews in World War II. Pius XI finally settled what was called the Roman question. So the Roman question was...
I'm learning something.
What do we do with the Vatican? Okay, so remember in 1870 with Pius IX, he loses the papal state, so he no longer has control over a country. Well, what happened in that moment was that the Vatican was sort of assumed into Italian politics, and like the Italian government was in a certain way in control of it. But there was this tension, there was this friction, and they were trying to really figure out, like, okay, what is the Vatican, and like, what is its relationship to Italy? And so Pius XI was dealing with a lot of these questions, a lot of these discussions, and eventually he was able to work it out to where Vatican City became its own sovereign nation. And so Vatican City, even though it's this tiny little thing in the middle of Rome, which is in the middle of Italy, it has its own control. So that's going to play a huge role in World War II, because what side was Italy on in World War II?
The Axis powers.
Right. So Germany, Hitler, Japan, right? So like the Axis powers, Italy was in that. And so the Vatican, if the Vatican had been a part of Italy, that's going to cause a lot of problems. The Vatican is not part of Italy, and so therefore the Vatican can take its own stance.
In fact, the Vatican is called an enclave, which means it's a nation completely surrounded by one other nation, locked in, if you will. That's what enclave, claves, means keys. So locked in another nation. There's a couple other ones, San Marino. What's the one in South Africa? It's like
Oh, I can't remember.
Oh crap! The guy just went to jail. Anyway, go move on.
Okay, so the other thing that Pius XI did was he wrote some pretty strongly worded encyclicals against these various systems that were popping up. So he wrote a specific one to the Italian people and the Italian government against fascism and condemning fascism. He wrote one to the German people condemning Nazism, and the people who printed that encyclical in Germany had their publishing company shut down by Hitler, right? So they have the state control of the media. And so if they're printing anything that the dictator doesn't want, then they shut them down, right? Or they execute them, or they do whatever they need to do in order to shut people up. Okay, so that thing was actually pulled from the presses because of his harsh words against Nazism. And then he also wrote another encyclical very specifically condemning communism. So again, he's writing against the communist totalitarian governments as well as the fascist and the Nazi governments. Okay, moving into World War II, Pius XII ascends the papal throne, and he also was strongly against Nazism, but he loved the German people because he had actually spent time as a diplomat in Germany. And so his heart was sort of torn by what was happening in Germany, and he wanted to basically do whatever he could to protect Catholics in Germany and also call them to resistance. So what he decided was actually criticize, and maybe we'll talk about Pius XII and some of the things that people have said about him that are not true over the years, was he declared neutrality during World War II for the Vatican. So again, the Vatican is its own country now, and so he has the ability to either join the Allies or the Axis powers or declare neutrality, and he declares neutrality, so we're not on any side. Well, he was criticized for that, right? Because people were like, why would you not join the Allies? Like, why would you, like, are you a supporter of Hitler? Like, all of that kind of stuff. But his reasoning behind declaring neutrality was that he knew what Hitler would do if he came out in support of the Allied powers. He would retaliate against Catholics in Germany, who Pius XII deeply loved and he saw himself as the spiritual father of. He would also retaliate, as he did in Holland when this happened, against the Jews. So not even against Catholics, but against the Jews. And so Pius XII was aware of all of this, and he was like, okay, I think that the best way for us to actually do good in this war is to declare neutrality on the surface, but behind the scenes, secretly support the Allied powers. Right. So espionage, all sorts of stuff like that, right? And so these are fascinating things. If you've never heard about Pius XII and all of the underground operations that are going on during World War II, it is really, really, really cool. All right. So have you heard about any of the slander that's been done against Pius XII?
Oh, yeah, of course. They call him the Nazi Pope, and they say he didn't do enough for the Jews of Rome. But one thing I do know is that the head rabbi of Rome converted, correct? After World War II to Catholicism because of what his encounter with the church and with the Pope and what the Pope did in hiding Jews in the Vatican and even kicking nuns out of the convent so Jews could hide there. That converted the head rabbi. So the head rabbi of Rome is converting Catholicism. I don't think Pope Pius XII is
an actual Nazi sympathizer.
Exactly.
Right. So this is what happened in the 1950s after, I think, or maybe it was the 60s, after Pope Pius XII's death. There was a play that was published called The Deputy, which was slandering Pius XII, basically saying that he was in cahoots with Hitler the whole time and all of this kind of stuff. It had no historical basis. This playwright, did not have any sort of sources cited or anything. He just wrote this play. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of people for a long time to think that Pius XII really was on Hitler's team, right? But we have tons of historical documentation now that shows that actually the opposite was true, that Pius XII was working behind the scenes, and by the end of the war, he had saved over 800,000 Jews from death and execution in the concentration camps. And so huge underground network of people, like you mentioned, hiding people in convents, teaching them to say the Hail Mary so that whenever the Nazis are trying to press them, they are like, no, we're Catholic, we promise, right? Like there's all sorts of things like that.
But then that gets into the morality of espionage and lying, so we're not going to get into that.
We might get into that another time. But basically, you have Pius XII doing everything that he can secretly to help people who are suffering. And so, the head rabbi of Rome, his name was Israel Zoli. And he converted to Catholicism and actually took the Christian name Eugenio after Pius XII. His actual name was Eugenio Pacelli before he took the name Pius XII. And so he named himself after Pius XII. So that just shows, I guess, how much he was really in support of the Jews during the war.
The more you know.
The more you know. A couple of other important figures from World War II. I want to mention figures from your book, St. Maximilian Kolbe and St. Edith Stein, otherwise known as St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. That was her nun name. Benedicta of the Cross. Did I ever show y'all Leandro Dixon wrote a rap about this? Anyway, maybe I'll share it with you.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, so so this is these are saints who Maximilian Kolbe was a Catholic priest, Edith Stein was a Catholic nun, although she started out actually Jewish by heritage, but she became an atheist when she was very young. She studied philosophy and she became a pretty prominent philosophical writer, which was sort of unheard of for women during that time. But she was a feminist philosopher. But eventually, through her studies, through the life of the intellect, she came to a belief in God and eventually embraced the Catholic faith and continued to write her philosophy and even feminist philosophy from a Catholic perspective. And she eventually became a nun and was persecuted because of her Jewish heritage and her Catholic faith and was sent to the concentration camps. So both Maximilian Kolbe and Edith Stein became martyrs of concentration camps. So they're really important, I guess, witnesses to the faith, even in the midst of the greatest possible suffering that we can really imagine during this time period. All right, so Pius XII was the Pope for a long time. He was Pope all the way through World War II, and then he was all the way until 1958. So in the whole post-war period as well, Pius XII was a major figure. He was planting a lot of seeds of renewal in the church. He was doing a lot to sort of revive biblical studies and revive the practice of the liturgy. I'm pretty sure he was the one that reinstated a more intense and, I guess, colorful practice of Holy Week.
Before it was like you would wake up on Easter or Holy Saturday and you'd have the Easter Vigil, which is supposed to be at night with candles and in the dark, but it would be at like 7 a.m. on Saturday.
Yeah, and it would just be sort of like
womp womp. And so he reinstituted a fullness of Holy Week in the Triduum.
Right, so he was really just trying to revive like the practice of liturgy and make sure that we are experiencing the worship of God in a way that's really drawing in all of our senses.
He brought back a focus on chant, Gregorian chant.
Yep. And so lots of cool things like that. He wrote a ton. He wrote so many encyclicals, and a lot of his writings actually became the basis for a lot of the teachings of Vatican II, which is the council that's going to come in the 1960s. And so we'll talk about that in the next section. But Pius XII, the last thing that he is known for is he declared or officially defined the dogma of Mary's Assumption into heaven in 1950. And so again, this isn't something that he made up or that he came up with out of nowhere, but this is something that the church had believed since the beginning, but it had never officially been defined. So much like the Immaculate Conception we talked about back in the 1800s with Pius IX, Pius XII ends up declaring the Assumption. So
yeah, I always thought that it was an assumption that we believed that. So that's the point. It's not. It's an assumption. It's defined by Pius XII.
There you go. Now you have it. So 7.2.
Wash your hands.
Stay safe.